Okay. Welcome back to Tech Leader Stage. Had you had a great lunch? Okay, so please welcome with me on stage the open source panel, the engine of innovation in the digital age. Please join on stage Ankit Patel from NVIDIA, Maxim Vatyev from Temporal.io, Ivan Burazin from Daytona, and Joe Franchetti from Dino.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Excellent. So we're going to be running a 30-minute panel talking about all things open source today. But before we get started, let's introduce ourselves. So my name is Joe Franchetti, and I am a developer advocate at Dino. If you don't know what Dino is, we are an open source JavaScript runtime looking to make a delightful developer experience for our JavaScript developers out there with a TypeScript-first JavaScript runtime. So let's go down the line and introduce ourselves. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Maxim Vatyev. I am CTO and co-founder of Temporal. And Temporal is a company, but it's also an open source project, which we started 8 years ago at Uber. And this project been around for a while, and now we have a company, 200 plus people, which grew out of that open source project. And we have a booth. Please visit us. We can learn more about it. Oh, ask me questions.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ivan Burazin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Daytona. Daytona is a open source, what we call dev environment manager. Basically, we automate everything for the developer to get up and running instantaneously and not worry about reading through the README and banging your head against the wall to get it up and running. Daytona is 100% open source. It's an Apache 2.0 license, so check it out. Thanks.
Hey, so my name is Ankit Patel. I lead developer marketing or developer engagement at NVIDIA. And kind of been there for a little while. NVIDIA, I guess I should explain, NVIDIA makes hardware. A lot of people know about NVIDIA and hardware and probably thinking about 5090s and stuff like that, but we do a lot of software as well. We have hundreds and hundreds of open source, actually. So I just counted yesterday, 750 open source, permissively licensed projects. But open source is also a continuum in terms of governance and whatnot. So yeah, we have a lot of open source work that we do at NVIDIA as well.
Nice. Okay, so you all briefly touched on it in your introductions already, but do you want to each go a little bit deeper into sort of how your particular organizations are using open source and sort of what you think the state of open source is at the moment?
Everyone's looking at each other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start. I don't know if it's the right way or wrong way. I know that for us at Daytona, this is me and my co-founder have done multiple companies, but it's the first one that we've launched first as an open source project. And so historically, we've used open source, but we have not created in that manner open source. And it took us and while we're learning and deciding how to do this, while creating a business so that we can create something for the community and have a business later on, we thought about it for like 9 months, talked to lawyers, looked at licenses, looked at how to create cutoffs between things that are in the open source project versus what are in the proprietary enterprise product. And it took us quite a while to get there, but we finally sort of figured out how to do it. I don't know if it's applicable to everyone, but what I did figure out when talking to other open source founders, I was at an open source founder meet quite recently, is that a lot of people, when they start out these companies, they don't think about the monetization strategy or how the business is going to succeed later on. You just create the open source project. And then when you do that, somewhere down the line, you get into issues like HashiCorp did quite recently. I mean, Sentry's doing well, but they had an issue a while back as well. So it's like, the only thing that I'm seeing that's common among founders, and I don't know how to solve this, is not thinking up front of where the company will be and what can we actually give out open source really permissively, because that's what we want to, versus what we can do on the long run with that. So that's my kickoff to that.
It's good. I mean, I can add, NVIDIA's got a different, because we have a monetization mechanism and stuff. So for us, a lot of open source, I guess you could break it down into a couple of things. obviously create projects and put them out in open source, but we also contribute to a lot of projects, right? We contribute to Kubernetes, we contribute to PyTorch, TensorFlow. So for us, connecting developers to our hardware and meeting developers where they are, that's kind of the thing, right? If there's a community behind a certain open source project, we'll go, we'll help it, we'll make sure it's able to access the GPU. Thank you for implementing that. It's so yeah, so that's kind of how we contribute. There's also a consumption component, right, where we use open source internally, and so we'll go through and say, okay, we're going to use some of those projects for why? Because why would we invent it ourselves if it already exists and it's great? We'll just use it. There's another part where we will create a project, but actually it's not we develop it secret, and then we open source it. We'll just do our development open source, right? So all the roadmaps, everything is just open source, and it's just a project. We just work in an open source way. The engineering team just works in an open source way. So that's kind of the different approaches that we have. And I'm probably forgetting some.
Nice. And Maxim?
Our project is kind of interesting because we actually started that as a part of the big company. We started it as engineers at Uber. So I was just an engineer, and the co-founder of the company is also worked with me at Uber. And we just started that project. And back then, Uber was, I don't know how it is right now, but back then, Uber was super receptive to allow you practically start building in the open. We started to build it in the open. First year or two, we had zero external interest. But we were growing it internally, grew it to 100 use cases internally. And then at some point, it started to pick up external adoption. And then we started the company. And now we have a company around that open source project. And certainly, it's the easiest way to kind of do that because you practically bootstrap inside of a big company. And I do think it's still beneficial for Uber because I do think that these days, if you're building infrastructure level technology and it stays within a single company, this technology will eventually die. I think it just doesn't make sense to build a complex infrastructural technology and keep it proprietary. I witnessed that at Amazon actually multiple times, because when I joined Amazon in 2002, Amazon was far, far ahead in multiple dimensions, in kind of service-oriented architecture, in kind of in scale, and so on. But almost all of their technologies were internal. And then what happened is that 10 years later, people come and like, look, okay, why are you using this outdated technology? We have this open source alternative. And Amazon, this time, most of those projects fizzled. Like a good example was I built an inversion of control container for Java at Amazon. And like a year later in production, somebody came to me, do you know this Spring thing? I'm like, what's Spring? And because we practically kind of invented our own way to do that, but we never open sourced that, so nobody even knew about it. So it's interesting. I think at least for big companies, building infrastructure level projects as open source is the right approach, even if eventually it becomes an independent company and can grow independently.
Nice. And do any of you, or in fact all of you, have a particular interaction with open source that you've had that you're sort of particularly proud of that you'd like to call out?
Well, there's our Kubernetes recent. I'll call out a Kubernetes one. We have lots. I said we have lots of ones, but Kevin's in the audience, so I'm going to make sure I call out Kevin. Kevin's a core maintainer on Kubernetes. He's here, Kevin Clues, and we're proud of it because Kubernetes came out. There's no GPUs wasn't a thing that you needed to access, but now you got GPUs. If you're using the world runs on Kubernetes, so much of the internet runs on Kubernetes, and you can access GPUs. Now we're even leading new initiatives with device controllers or the dynamic resource allocation. So pretty good work there. So
we use that inside of Daytona's enterprise products to enable GPUs, just so you know. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Amazing. Any other open source interactions you'd like to call out? No?
Well, I could call out more, but one more. This is interesting.
Sure.
So in terms of, and this probably kind of leads to a related topic with open source and kind of, it's taken a lot more importance. We've always had open source, right? Like if you look at the internet, most of the servers running Linux or everything's running Nginx or Apache, and right, there's a lot of open source infrastructure. I think what's happening is with the open models, right? You're having with AI models, and you have companies here like Mistral that are putting out open. You got Meta putting out open kind of things. So that's kind of interesting, and bringing a lot of attention to open source in a different way now. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and the three of you are obviously all very on board with the idea of open source, but how do you think, companies and organizations as a whole can do more to promote the idea of open source, and do you think they should be?
And as I said, you want, I think if you build an infrastructural project, either use open source and improve it, or make your own open source. I think just inventing your own, it usually comes from too many resources. And every time I saw somebody reinventing the wheel, it's usually when you have too many engineers, and engineers are busy, don't know what to do, and don't have enough work. And sometimes it's good, right? You can come up with something. But I think, again, if you're doing it as open source, it makes sense. If you're doing it internally and this project will eventually die, I don't think it's a good idea to do that. And I want to repeat that as a large organization.
Yeah, I guess it depends, though. It depends on the purpose, right? So we're saying open source a lot, but there's different types of open source, right? There's open source where you're saying, hey, the source is accessible. I'm looking at pull requests and I'm kind of understanding, I'm going to accept it. But then there's open governance, which is kind of part of open source, right? And so I think those are two different things that you kind of have to think about. Am I going fully in on open source? Then I have to have open governance, have to have distributed. You kind of want to think of a community, building a community around it, not just, it's not just about the source code. It's the people updating the documentation. It's the people organizing the gatherings. It's a community. And so I think that's kind of, I'm tainted, because when I think open source, you think about the 4 freedoms and you think about all that, like that's a type of open source, right? But I think a lot of times people say open source and they kind of mean source open, which is, hey, I'm going to share my source code. And I'm done.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point that there's a massive human side to open source. And with that in mind, I know it's difficult to touch upon the ethics of open source, but how do you think large companies, large organizations can help make open source an ethical and maintainable practice?
Well, it's like targeted directly at me, large companies.
You're the largest company here.
Opinion.
You're the largest company. I mean, we don't have to hit on the largest company, which is the most valuable company, by the way, which has the most money of everyone else, by the way.
This is on your shoulders.
Yeah, I'm doubling down
We
on
do
that.
feel a responsibility.
Yeah.
Keep going.
No, I mean, generally in open source, I think there's 3 things, like supporting, educating, and actually building. So supporting, I mean by the open source projects that you use, and we all use them in our project, you should be, especially if you have some sort of financial benefit from that, you should seed some finance to that.
Absolutely.
Like how much is that's a whole different discussion, but something should be done there, especially for the true open source projects, which you're referring to, which is not based, where there's no company around it, but they're doing that. The second, I think, is education, and the sense of can we educate people to work on open source. And I mean this both internally and externally. So externally, it's very simple in the sense of can we teach the next generations that they should do that for X, Y, and Z reasons. And the reasons are very transparent. 72% of employers look at your GitHub track record and what you've contributed to. I think DigitalOcean said 62% of their promotions internally, they looked at their engineers' external contribution. So there's all these things that can be done. But also internally, and this is sort of a quirky thing that happened really recently in our company. So we use Keycloak, which is an Auth0 open source project for authorization, right? And there was some issue, and our team internally solved that. And it's part of the open source project, so you can see that we solved that. But we didn't push it back to Keycloak, but a contributor of Daytona saw that.
Yeah.
And there was a bounty, and he picked up a bounty copying pasting the code that we made. So, I mean, the sense of why I'm bringing this up, it's a quirk that we didn't just commit it back originally, but it's a process in the mind of the engineer, which you have to educate. If you solve this, please contribute
it's important to contribute back.
Contribute it back, right?
Yeah, I think and that's part of what the governance bodies type of things do, is because they're trying to maintain a standard, right? So part of the problem that happens is you end up with an open source project, and then everybody has their own version. All right, and then this forking, and then you know how it works with branch management and merging, and it's a nightmare. So kind of keeping some of that clean is a good thing, and engineers have to have also the time. So you mentioned that in your thing, way that big companies can support is you need managers that are empathetic to the fact that a maintainer isn't just working on the code that we are doing. They're maintaining overall projects. So there's a responsibility outside of the work that that the manager has to think of the day-to-day job of their contribution to the company, but they have to think of contribution outside of that as well, which is important and part of the job. And it's difficult because you talked about mapping that back, like you said, back into the value for the company is not direct, it's indirect.
But it is like, and I think we're going to talk about this a bit later, but it's like every software product has, open source components. I'm pretty sure everyone does, everyone, right? And so like if the compiled code is Daytona, our project, and if a dependency, an open source project has something missing or not doing, then contributing to that is essentially, again, contributing to your project. But some managers might be harder to understand.
Yeah, some managers don't understand, and then they're like, why are you working on that? So that becomes difficult.
I think it's just, as usual, it's all about incentives. And there are monetary incentives and there are like non-monetary incentives. And I don't think we found the model yet. At least my feeling is that there are like very different types of open source. There are like these big community projects nobody owns, and sometimes they go sideways big time and become bureaucratic machines. Sometimes it's just one person having fun and building something. Sometimes there is company around that. And I think each of them is very, very different, and incentives are extremely different. And I don't know. I don't think there is one answer there. It's just I think we need to innovate there. I still don't think we are kind of in this weird phase, especially with all these license changes and like business models. I think practically the only practical business model for open source right now is practically SaaS offerings, and all big companies are sponsoring that because they have too much money to spend, right? But the reality is that I don't think there is still good answer how to build a business around open source, and most of it is not really monetizable, which means that probably with time it will not, unless it becomes really large and a lot of companies participate in it, it will die off.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just thinking because when you're saying there's all these projects, different types of projects, I was recently heard like GitHub has 100 million projects. Like you're not going to monetize 100 million projects, right? You just said it, right? So you need, but there are different monetization business models, right? Where you have your open source is kind of like the core, you add value on top. You guys are doing that.
Yeah, so that's what we were trying, and to your point, I think that when you're doing like doing a SaaS version of open source is probably the hardest to defend if everything is in the core. So ideally, people don't like, I also figured out that open core is a bad word in the open source community. But in the sense of if you create an open source project, and this is our belief anyway, the open source project is like the foundation that you then upstream into your enterprise product. So it's essentially one more open source project inside of that. And then the value that is on top of that is the value that you charge for, not the value that's in there.
The product, that's the other thing. When you go learn about product management in business school, it's like, okay, the product is not just the package, right? Like, this is not the product. The product is the distribution of it, the promotion of it, all this other stuff around the actual source code is the product. The product is the whole thing.
That's why they can sell a Dior bag for $2,800 and make it for $50. I don't know if you saw that release. So Dior bags that came out last week or whatever, they make it for like $50 or whatever, and they sell it for $2,800 or whatever.
Because it's value. There's value there. And so that's the problem. That's the business model question is, where's the value? How are you going to create value where the value is not the binary code? Right?
Yeah, for example, we opted out of open core model. We don't serve like crippled version of software then to put enterprise version on top of that. Our open source is fully featured. Like all the features are available. The only difference is that we can run the backend for you on the cloud, but open source is absolutely a fully featured product.
Yeah, but
it's not common, but it's a different model.
Yeah, but even there, like there's other things where you can have security checking and enterprise support and all these other, there's things you can
add. And we opted out of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, we decided not to do that because I think it makes open source, again, there is very clear, again, incentives, right? The moment you have this separation, your incentives are keep that core as bad as possible, right?
No, I'm saying same code, just support, enterprise support is a value add. And
yes.
But the fact that we're having this conversation means there are multiple business models you can have around it.
Yeah. And I think it, again, depends on the project. For example, for us, we decided not to do enterprise support.
Right.
We only support
That's a choice, right? Exactly, yeah.
But some people make money doing enterprise support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you said you're not sure about what the ideal might look like with regards to incentivization, but do you think maybe, I mean, if we imagine an ideal world, like what do you think the licensing model is fit for purpose right now? Do you think it's fit for purpose, say 10 years, 30 years in the future? And if so, what might an ideal future for open source look like?
I think one thing is that, oh, sorry, you want to go ahead? Yeah. I don't think we are in good shape right now with all these license changes. I don't like them. But at the same time, it's clear why companies are doing that. And they're scared of big cloud providers. And problem is that these licenses don't solve the problem, right? They create more problems. And we talk to those lawyers, and the first thing they say to you is that moment you change license, even if you copy MIT license and like make it something else, you put huge burden in adoption, because companies have whitelisted licenses, blacklisted licenses, and like gray area. If you take MIT license and call it my license and copy word by word, it's gray area. So anyone needs to go and consult a lawyer before using that. So any license change is huge, huge impediment. Unfortunately, if you could have standard license which says anyone can do whatever, but Amazon cannot run it, but so far nobody was able to invent one, and there is no standard around that. And so far, I think we're in kind of this interesting situation when everybody's scared of big cloud providers, and that's why they're doing these changes. And these changes cripple their communities, and I don't think anyone found an answer.
I just want to add on that, like, I absolutely believe what you said, like, adding more licenses is just going to make it more complex. That just makes it harder. Like, ideally, the licenses that we have in the sense of, like, fully permissive, we have two of fully permissive, MIT, Apache, like, most people understand that they can do whatever they want. AGPL 3, I think, is like you just can't sell that as a SaaS, but you can basically run everything else. And so everything else are like variations, and at your point, a lot of companies won't use it because they need to call a lawyer and whatnot. So I think what we decided, and what I think is like, it's more about trying to work in a world where you have, restrictive, permissive licenses, 2, 3, 4, whatever you have, and make your monetization strategy work within those. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think changing the license and creating a new one is going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to make things easier, because everyone here in the audience is not going to go, oh, I want to read this and try to figure this out. I know that when we work on things, it's like, is it MIT? Is it Apache? If it is, we use it. If it's not, just like go to the next thing, because it just takes too much time to do that. So I don't know that any license in the next 30 years will change anything, and I would rather people focus on how they can create value for a user in that license that they have, while charging for a different set or a different user.
Okay, so I'm gonna change it. I'm gonna adjust it a little bit. So we're talking about you're basically saying I don't care about the 4 freedoms. I just really want to use it, right? Because I was thinking back, the core open source license was the 4 freedoms, right? The ability to use, modify, something else, and distribute. I forgot what the third one was. That is fine when talking about open source. I mentioned open models. There's a big conversation around open source licensing for open models. And that's different, because now there's source code, there's data, there's the reproducibility is complicated. There's a lot more to it and so there's an open debate right now about what does that look like. And so companies are innovating. Meta came out with they were the first ones to drop open weights for Llama. And so that, they came out with a license, they moved the needle. NVIDIA actually had we released recently a reward model. So a reward model is a model that takes actually I'll have to go back up a second. So when you want to generate data, you can use an LLM to generate data. You can just generate a bunch of data with it, right? Say, hey, generate me 1,000 reviews of this water, and it just generates it. But then, are they good or bad? And so a reward model, you take that as input, and it'll score the answer. And it's a human eval kind of thing. How good is it? How bad is it? How human friendly is the answer? And so these reward models weren't really open, but we said, hey, that's important for people building or customizing LLMs. We want to have an open reward model out there. So we wrote an NVIDIA license that was an open license that said, hey, here's a reward model, and you can use it for commercial, for whatever you want, right? And that was one of the things a lot of people picked up on when we put out that model. So there's room for innovation, especially in the open model space around licensing.
Yeah, and I really think, I mean, I don't want to directly disagree with you both, but I really think there is space for some sort of licensing that says, you know, companies up to this size, making this amount of profit, can use this for free, MIT, whatever. If you're over this size, if you're making this amount of profit, it's going to cost you this much to use it. And that doesn't feel like a prohibitive lawyering up situation to me.
Are you suggesting that it becomes part of a license? Because that, now you're taking control away from the creator of the project that says, I think it's worth X, or I think it's worth Y. There's a business model thing, because by putting that in, you're enforcing a business model on them. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying that yes, we need to support these things so they don't go. Because if you know, a big company is depending on this maintainer doing this small project on the side, let's make sure that that continues, right?
And that's the major issue, isn't it? We don't want to be burdening these, you know, lone devs who are creating this one project that is used in literally everybody's product out there. We want to make sure that they're living a happy life and are, you know, compensated for the work that they're doing.
And are they even continuing to maintain it? Maybe they're not. Maybe this is done. They're off to doing something else.
So there is an app, and there is a questions panel in the WeAreDevelopers app where the audience can ask questions. We aren't going to take audience questions on this panel, but if you do want to ask any of our panelists a question, they are going to be answering the questions in the text after this panel. So do jump in the app and chat to each of our panelists if you would like to.
Can I plug I'm going to be doing the main stage presentation later today, so maybe I'm worried that thing might not be full. Please do,
plug away. So what is it you're doing?
Oh, so there's a talk later. I'm going to have a talk on the main stage. I'm going to talk a little bit about new applications and how LLMs are used there, but I'm also just going to talk about accelerated computing and how NVIDIA kind of accelerates applications. So.
Nice. And do either of you have a closing remark that you would like to say, or maybe your hopes for open source in the future?
My hope that we can find some medium when kind of some state when people can contribute to open source and create new open source projects, and at the same time find ways to create the right incentives for these projects to thrive long term. Because I think right now we're kind of in this a little bit weird situation when I think at least 10 years ago it was much. I think people were like much more excited about open source than they are right now, and I think we need to fix that.
I have nothing smarter to say than what you said. I just feel that I do feel that more and more people are getting into open source, which I think is great, and so hopefully with the more people coming in, we'll find like two heads are better than one. We sort of figure out a solution to the problem.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. Can we have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists? Thank you.
Yep.